So before I begin, I just want to thank all of the teachers that I've had over the past 13 years. I would not be the person I am today without any of you, and I definitely would not be able to get up here and give this speech. The scariest book I have ever read is Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss. And it's not due to a lack of exposure to the horror genre that I consider it to be a terrifying work of fiction. I just watched Alien and Aliens for the first time last weekend, and while they are both incredible films, neither can send a chill up my spine the way Dr. Seuss's poetic children's book can. Now, those of you who have either seen the Alien movies or have not read Horton Hears a Who are probably confused right now. So I have put together a short synopsis of my favorite Seuss story for everybody. Horton the elephant is having a grand old time romping around in the jungle when he discovers a rather peculiar dust speck floating in the wind. When he stops to take a closer look, or rather, a closer listen, he is astounded to hear the voices of tiny people coming from the dust speck. He learns that there is an entire town, Whoville, full of Who people living on top of the dust speck. They are too small to see, but Horton can hear them using his big ears. However, the rest of the jungle animals, with their small ears, are more skeptical of the existence of Whoville. Some call Horton insane, but others take more drastic measures. First, the sour kangaroos try to drown Whoville. Then, the Wickersham monkeys and Vladikov the eagle team up to steal the dust speck and hide it in a field of clovers that is 100 miles wide. Horton is able to retrieve Whoville after searching exactly 3 million clovers, but the Wickersham monkeys and the sour kangaroos return to cage Horton so they can dispose of the troublesome dust speck once and for all. And throughout the whole book, Horton does not waver once. He implores the rest of the jungle animals to listen, repeating over and over again, "A person's a person, no matter how small." All looks lost when the Whos are saved in the nick of time because they all work together to make so much noise that all the other animals can hear them, and everybody lives happily ever after. Now, the reason Horton Hears a Who scares me so much is because of how the jungle animals treated Horton. They either sat and ignored him or actively worked to destroy the dust speck. But Horton never gives up. He persists through their stony indifference and apathy, standing by the universal truth that all the other animals deny. A person's a person, no matter how small. Horton's plight, while it may seem to merely be a fun children's story, is anything but. We can see Horton's struggle all around us. We can see it in other works of fiction like Harry Potter and Star Wars, and we can see it in history through people like Rosa Parks and Malala Yousafzai. Like Horton, the people in these stories did not succumb to the pressure of a flawed society. Harry Potter did not allow his government to hide the truth of Voldemort's return, even when that meant he was tortured by his own defense against the dark arts teacher. By the same token, Malala Yousafzai did not allow highly sexist laws and social rules stop her from pursuing equal education for herself and her peers, even when that meant she took a Taliban bullet to the head when she was only 15 years old. We look upon these people, fictitious and real, as heroes because they did not let the ethics of their time define their actions. Like Horton, they stood up, no matter how many stood against them, and said to all who would hear, "No, this is not right, and we can be better." And now it is our turn to follow in Horton's footsteps and take a stand to make our nation better. 2016 was by no means a fun year to live through, but it did something very important for us all. This past year has forced us to take a good, hard, long look in the mirror, and in doing so, we have had to come to terms with the fact that what we see reflected back is not good. Xenophobia, and more specifically Islamophobia, were brought to stage front and center by the worst refugee crisis since World War II. In 2015, the number of people forcibly displaced from their homes exceeded 60 million. But it is easy to forget that these refugees are people too. They are people whose homes have been brutally taken from them. They are people who are living through the worst humanity has to offer. In Syria, civilians are attacked by rebel groups, ISIS, and even their own government. And now, these refugees have come under attack from foreign nations as well, ourselves included. Led by political efforts to block refugees from coming into the United States, our country is growing increasingly Islamophobic. In 2015, the FBI reported that hate crimes against Muslims spiked by 67%. Others have reacted to terror by demanding, among other things, immigration bans and religious tests. But little do we realize, these actions actually have the opposite effect. They do not limit the power of terrorist organizations, they actually strengthen them. Terrorist organizations like ISIS thrive by turning us against each other. Alina Khan, a Muslim teenager, eloquently described ISIS goals. Quote, "Muslims live in fear that they will be attacked. Americans live in fear that Muslims will attack them," end quote. And not only is a ban impractical and detrimental to the fight against terror, it stands against everything that makes us American. The United States of America is a nation of immigrants. And unless you are a Native American, your family came to this country, whether they were looking for a land free of religious persecution, came here on a slave ship, or for whatever reason, they founded a nation that prided itself on equal opportunity and new beginnings. And that's the fundamental idea behind the American dream, that no matter who you are or what you went through, that you can come to this nation, and if you work hard, you can live a good life. Yet here we are, promoting this legislation and rhetoric that is in direct conflict with everything that makes us American. And on top of the wave of fear that is growing internationally, a hatred we all know well is rearing its ugly head: racism. Race relations have seemingly exploded over the past few years, and while it may seem that this has happened unexpectedly, the causes have been in clear view ever since President Nixon took office. His law and order policies were thinly veiled attempts to vilify the black community. In top words of a Nixon advisor, the Nixon administration, quote, "had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did," end quote. The presidents after Nixon continued this rhetorical war, and President Clinton executed it. The Clinton administration passed devastating legislation, such as mandatory minimums and the three-strike policy. They even turned black kids into symbols of fear through the idea of super predators. In the words of Hillary Clinton, these super predators were, quote, "not just gangs of kids anymore. They have no conscience, no empathy," end quote. These thinly veiled racial policies were and still are executing through another corrupting facet of society, the United States justice system. I was surprised to recently learn that prisons are not only a private industry, but are an extremely profitable one. The reason shocked me even more. Despite the fact that the United States consists of 5% of the world's population, our prisons hold 25% of the world's prisoners. That means that 1/4 of all the prisoners on the globe are Americans. It was not until 2010 that arrest quotas were banned in New York, but many officers have repeatedly stated that the practices continue unofficially. One NYPD police officer spoke of a 20 and run rule, that each officer must give 20 tickets and 1 arrest each month. Quote, "The culture is you're not working unless you're writing summonses or arresting people," end quote. And while our justice system encourages the mass incarceration of the poor and minority communities, we allow white-collar criminals to walk out of heinous crimes with nothing but a slap on their wrist. In his testimony to Congress regarding the 2008 economic crash, Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO and chairman of Goldman Sachs, stated that he saw no conflict of interest in selling mortgage securities to clients at the same time his company bet that those same securities would fail. He is still the CEO of Goldman Sachs today. And after the full exposure of the crash, only one man was sent to jail for putting millions of Americans on the streets. And now we are rolling back the regulations that we put in place after the crash to make sure nothing like it would ever happen again. And this just barely scratches the surface. Construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline is continuing despite the fact that it disrupts the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's sacred burial sites and jeopardizes their water source. We have just overturned hard-won and much-needed legislation and protections for transgender students in schools. Just after the horrors of Guantanamo Bay have come to light, we have become increasingly open to torture as a method of gaining information, despite experts' repeated statements that, regardless of its morality, it is ineffective and does not work. I could go on and on. Now, not all of us agree on these issues, and that's okay, or it would have been okay. Because on top of the divides in our country, we are losing the very thing that allows us to fix these fractures, our basic understanding of what is fact and what is fiction. That is what scares me the most. As horrifying as all the things I just mentioned are, none of them scare me. And that's because we live in a country that gives us a path to be able to talk about these issues. It's built into the foundations of our country that we can all make change without fear of being thrown in jail. And it's not just written into the law. It's a social code we have upheld for 200 years. And that basic understanding is eroding. In an era of alternative facts, we must be careful. It's why I've put together a bibliography for my SAGE, or a works cited, since EasyBib doesn't use Chicago anymore, or doesn't have it for free, so that I can't stand up here and say what I want with no regard to what is fact. Blatant lies perpetrated at the highest levels of government cannot be accepted as acceptable. Indifference to lies is exactly what authors like George Orwell warn us against. If you look throughout history at countries and leaders who have named the press the enemy of the people, you will find a long list of dictators and tyrants. By claiming that facts are fiction and by twisting the truth, we are rapidly losing our ability to come together and tackle these issues. It is imperative to the future of our nation that we walk forward with the same courage that Horton had. In Horton Hears a Who, it was not until all of the Whos worked together to yell, shout, and make as much noise as they could that they were heard by the other jungle animals. So get up and make some noise. Call, email, and write to your representatives. Go out and march in rallies for issues that you care about. Get involved in local politics, and get registered to vote. We all have a voice, and we're not going to change anything until we start using it. We must not remain silent. We must stand for what we believe in. So when we look upon these gross injustices, remember Horton the elephant and what he stood for, that a person is a person, no matter how small. Like Malala Yousafzai, like Harry Potter, like Rosa Parks, like Luke Skywalker, and like Horton the elephant, we cannot be swayed by leaders with silver tongues and alternative facts. We must hold on to the truths that we know in our hearts are inalienable and universal. For our brothers, our sisters, our friends and our family, for all of our neighbors, for all that is good and just, we must have the courage to stand up and do what is right. The world is depending on us.